Chapter 1. Eleanor Price, now by the grace of a marriage certificate and a quantity of paperwork that would have impressed a parliamentary clerk, Her Grace the Duchess of Hartfield had kept a private accounting of her husband's warmth. Not because she was the sort of woman who tallied affection like a shopkeeper counting farthings into a till. She was precisely that sort of woman with the household accounts, had been since the age of 16, and she saw no reason the principle should not extend to matrimony. She kept the account because the figures were small enough to keep. A woman with a generous husband would have needed a second ledger. Nell needed a margin note. In 1 year of marriage, Lord Julian Ashworth, 7th Duke of Hartfield, had said, "Good morning, Eleanor," approximately 365 times, in a tone suggesting the words had been approved by committee, vetted for excessive warmth, and released into the breakfast room only after confirming they contained no dangerous levels of personal feeling. He had complimented her dress twice, both at public occasions where praising one's wife carried the same emotional weight as observing that the roads were in tolerable repair. In daylight, in full view by his own volition, he had touched her hand 4 times, once at the altar, once helping her from a carriage, twice at balls when the figures of the dance demanded it, and even then with the careful, minimal contact of a man returning a library book he had borrowed by accident. These were the touches she counted. There were others she did not count because they belonged to a different ledger. He came to her room at night, and the visits were what they were, and he was present in the way a man can be present and still be somewhere else entirely. And in the morning the door between their rooms was closed again, and he appeared at breakfast and said, "Good morning, Eleanor," as though nothing had passed between them, and this was, in its way, the most accurate thing about their marriage, because proximity is not closeness, and a man who is beside you in the dark and a stranger in the daylight is a man you sleep next to and wake up alone. She did not count those nights. Counting them would have required reconciling the man in the dark with the man at the breakfast table, and that particular arithmetic was one she preferred not to perform. On no occasion, in 12 months, in the presence of any person or the absence of any person, in daylight or in dark, had Julian Ashworth said the words, "I love you." Nell, who had a mind that worked like a clean ledger and a heart that worked like everything a ledger was not, did not record this deficit in writing. She kept it in the precise, private, slightly exhausted region of her chest that had stopped expecting a different number sometime around June, when the English roses were blooming and her marriage was not, and when she had decided, watching him eat his Tuesday eggs at the exact pace he ate his Monday eggs, that she had married a man who experienced breakfast, and possibly all human connection, on a schedule. She was not entirely wrong about the schedule. She was entirely wrong about the reason for it. It should be noted, before anyone assembles a gallows, that Julian Ashworth was not a bad husband. He was, by the Ton's standards, a magnificent one. He provided, he protected, he managed the estate with the meticulous competence of a man who found genuine comfort in arithmetic and genuine terror in everything arithmetic could not measure. He did not gamble. He did not drink to excess. He did not keep a mistress. He was, in every quantifiable dimension, faultless. He was also, in every unquantifiable dimension, absent. And the unquantifiable dimensions are where a marriage lives, which Nell had discovered in much the way a person discovers a hole in a roof. Slowly, then all at once, then every time it rained. She had married him because she liked him. She genuinely liked him. His quietness, his stillness, the way he watched her when she spoke as if he were committing every syllable to some internal archive for future consultation. She had believed the quietness was shyness, and that the shyness would ease with time, and that the man underneath the composure was the man she would be married to. She was half right. The man underneath the composure was the man she was married to. She had simply never met him, and the composure, which she had assumed was a thin coat to be shed in the privacy of home, turned out to be structural, load-bearing, a wall that went all the way down. Julian Ashworth was 27 and had been building that wall for 13 of those years. Not a wall of brick or stone, though he would have understood the engineering of either and probably found it more emotionally comfortable. A wall of measured words and controlled silences and calibrated distances. Of, "Good morning, Eleanor," when he meant something so different from good morning that the words might as well have been in another language. Of hands held behind his back when they wanted to reach. Of a face kept still when the muscles beneath it were doing something complicated and mutinous and deeply inconvenient. The wall predated Nell by 12 years. It had been constructed by a boy of 14 who had watched his father, the 6th Duke, love his mother. The old Duke was not a cruel man. He was a large one. He filled rooms the way weather fills a valley. He could not enter a breakfast without making it an occasion. He could not receive good news without embracing the nearest footman. He once wept at a lamb, for reasons the household never fully established, and his wife held his hand while he wept, and her face, over his bent head, had the particular stillness of a woman who had held this hand many times before, and who would hold it many times again, and who was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Julian saw that face. He saw it at 14, over his father's bent head, and he understood something about love that most people do not learn until much later. That it is possible to love someone genuinely and also to exhaust them. That a feeling, offered without restraint, becomes a thing the other person must carry. His mother carried it. She carried it every day, and the carrying was visible if you watched closely. And Julian watched closely, and he decided. The way sons decide things about their fathers, with the absolute finality of someone who has found the one thing he must never become. He would not be the weather. He would be the house. He had been the house for 13 years, so convincingly that his own household believed it. His steward, his housekeeper, his valet, the ton. They all believed it. His wife, who slept 10 feet from him every night in a room connected to his by a door that opened at night and closed again every morning with a soft, definitive click that Nell had come to think of as the most precisely maintained boundary in England, believed it. Nell could hear him through that door, some nights. Not words, movement, the creak of his chair, the sound of a page turning. He read late. She knew this the way she knew the other useless facts of his existence. He took his coffee without sugar. He held a quill as though it owed him money, and he had, on a single occasion in October, mended a broken gate hinge at the eastern paddock with his own hands, while she watched from the garden path. And his hands, which were large and certain, and surprisingly capable for a man whose primary occupation was being important, had done something to her breathing that she had never discussed with anyone, and intended never to discuss with anyone. Because noticing the hands of a husband who gave you 4 touches a year was the kind of private absurdity she did not need. She noticed them anyway. She noticed the way he stood in a doorway, straight and still, as though the door frame required his structural support. She noticed the gray-green of his eyes in morning light, a color she privately considered wasted on a man who used those eyes primarily for reading drainage reports. She noticed, and she kept noticing the way a person keeps pressing a bruise, not because it felt good, but because the tenderness was the only evidence the thing was real. The only creature in the household who had never believed Julian's wall was Button. Button was a King Charles Spaniel who had arrived at Hartfield as a hunting dog, a designation that lasted approximately 9 hours before Button demonstrated a comprehensive and principled objection to hunting, to cold weather, to early mornings, and to any activity that did not involve sitting on the nearest available lap and receiving biscuits. Button had been purchased for Julian. Button had defected to Nell within a week, with the swift, pragmatic loyalty of a small animal who had assessed 2 humans and chosen the one more likely to accommodate biscuit-related ambitions. Button now slept on Nell's bed, followed Nell from room to room, and constituted, in the household's quiet understanding, the Duchess's only genuine companion. But in the evenings, when Nell read in the morning room and Julian sat in his study, Button would pad down the corridor and sit at Julian's feet and watch him with the patient, knowing, faintly accusing expression of a creature who could hear things people could not. On one occasion, Julian had looked down from his papers, regarded the dog with his usual composure, and addressed Button with the words, "You are in the wrong room," in precisely the tone he used for visiting magistrates. Button had remained. Julian had returned to his accounts. Neither had mentioned it again, though Nell, hearing the exchange through the study door, had pressed her hand against her mouth and laughed silently into her own palm, which was the closest she had come to affection for her husband in 3 months, and which she did not intend to examine. What Nell did not know, and what nobody in the household knew, because Julian had spent 13 years ensuring that nobody would ever know, was what the wall cost him. Every day, every morning, every breakfast. He sat across the table from his wife, and the distance between them was 30 feet of mahogany, and it was also the widest distance in his life. He looked at her over his newspaper, and his chest did something, a tightening, a pulling, and he folded the newspaper and drank his coffee, and the coffee tasted like nothing, because nothing tasted like anything when she was in the room, and he could not reach for her. He watched her butter toast, and the movement of her wrist, the turn of her hand on the knife, did something to his throat that he managed by swallowing, and by looking at the window, and by reminding himself that his father had watched his mother butter toast, and had told her she was beautiful, and the telling had filled the room, and his mother had smiled, and the smile had been tired, and Julian would not make Nell tired. He would make her nothing. Nothing was safe. Every morning he said, "Good morning, Eleanor," and every morning the words were a locked door, and behind the locked door was, "Good morning, Nell. I love you. I have loved you since the bee. I am sorry. I do not know how to do this without becoming him. Please do not leave. I cannot ask you not to leave because asking would be a feeling, and feelings are the door, and the door must stay shut. Good morning, good morning, good morning." Every morning the locked door, every morning the cost of the lock, every morning the face held still while the muscles beneath it fought, and the fighting was invisible, and the invisibility was the wall's greatest achievement and its greatest cruelty, because the wall did not merely hide Julian's feelings from Nell, it hid Julian's feelings from Julian, most of the time. Almost. Not quite. In the first months of the marriage, Nell had tried. She left small things for him, a novel she thought he might like placed on his desk, a sprig of lavender tucked into his coat pocket, a note folded into his morning paper that contained 6 words and her initial, and a full stop that held approximately 6 months of hope. What he did with these offerings was the most Julian Ashworth thing Julian Ashworth had ever done. If she had known it, the knowledge would have changed everything. She did not know it. It changed nothing. The distance between what was true and what was believed was approximately 30 feet, which was the distance from the drawer where he kept her note to the breakfast table where she sat, and 30 feet had never been wider. But that is for later. What Nell knew was this. She left a book, and it appeared on his shelf the next morning without comment. She left lavender, and it vanished. She left a note, and the note might as well have been a receipt from the butcher. 3 gestures, 3 silences. She was not a woman who required grand declarations. She would have settled for a sentence, a look, a returned note that said nothing more than, "Mine was good too." She got 4 words at breakfast and the sound of a page turning through a closed door. By June she stopped. There was a 4th thing, a small watercolor she had painted, a view of the garden from the morning room window. Not good, not professional, but careful and real, and hers. She carried it to his study door. The door was closed. She could hear him inside, the quill on paper, the sound of a man doing the only kind of work he permitted himself to do. She stood in the corridor holding the painting, and she listened to the quill scratch, and she understood, with the quiet, devastating clarity of a woman who had run the numbers, that the painting would receive the same silence the book and the lavender and the note had received, and the cost was no longer a price she could afford. She took the painting back to her room. She put it in a drawer, She closed the drawer. The closing was quiet, and nobody in the house heard it, and nobody noticed she had stopped trying, because the trying had been invisible, the way a woman's effort is often invisible, and the stopping was invisible too, and it meant that a woman could stand in a corridor and decide to stop reaching for her husband, and the husband would never know. And the not knowing was not cruelty, and it was not indifference, and it was, somehow, worse than both. She built her warmth elsewhere. In the garden. In the village, every Thursday, with a basket and a talent for listening. In the kitchen, making soup with Mrs. Hewitt on rainy afternoons, and with Button, who gave love without complexity, and without a single good morning that required decoding. This was the marriage. Two people in a vast house. One door that opened in the dark and closed in the morning. 365 good mornings that meant nothing, and everything, and nothing again. A watercolor in a drawer that nobody would find. It was January when the ice broke. Chapter 2. The lake at the eastern edge of the Hartfield estate, visible from the study windows across 300 yards of lawn, had been frozen for a week. Mr. Parrish, the groundskeeper, who had tested the ice for 30 years, declared it on the morning of the 14th of January to be sound as stone. What Mr. Parrish did not know was that a thaw upland 3 days earlier had swollen the stream feeding the lake from the north. The stream, running warmer and faster than in any January he could recall, had thinned the ice from beneath at the inlet in a strip roughly 8 feet wide, a strip that looked, from above, identical to the rest of the surface. It had formed since his test, silently, from below, the way the worst things do. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Nell walked to the lake with Button. Button ran ahead with the ecstatic, undignified joy of a small dog encountering a frozen landscape for what appeared, in Button's estimation, to be the first time in all of history, despite having encountered the identical landscape every afternoon for a week. Nell was wearing her winter coat. Not the Duchess's fur, which hung in the wardrobe and which she privately considered made her look like a woman trying to impersonate a more expensive woman. Her own coat. Dark blue wool, slightly worn at the elbows, brought from her father's house. In the basket over her arm was a flask of broth for the ice cutters. She had been bringing it every week since the freeze began because the men worked 4 hours in the cold and nobody had thought to bring them anything warm until she did. This was Nell. She noticed the gap between what existed and what should exist, and she filled it, and she did not wait to be asked. She walked across the ice toward the cutting area at the far end. The ice cutters were distant figures, 6 of them, saws making the slow, rhythmic sound of blades working through something that did not wish to be cut. The inlet was 40 yards from the cutting area. Nobody was near it. Nobody was watching. The sound was not dramatic, not a thunderclap. A low, deep, tearing sound, like fabric ripping slowly along a seam that had been holding for longer than it should. The surface beneath her right foot dropped 2 inches. She had half a second to understand what was happening before the ice opened and she went through. The water was not cold. Cold was a word for a thing that could be measured. What the water was an event, a full-body seizure, a contraction of every muscle simultaneously, a closing of the throat, a whiteness that replaced thought. She was under. She was under the ice. The current from the swollen stream pulled at her legs, dragging her sideways, and she fought it. She fought it with everything her body could remember about survival, and her hands found the ragged underside of the broken edge, the ice jagged where it had cracked, and she held on, her fingers locking onto the rough lip of the hole, the current pulling her body horizontal beneath the solid sheet, while her hands gripped the edge and her lungs burned, and the cold closed around her chest like a fist. Button stood at the edge of the hole and barked. Not the cheerful bark of a dog at play, the high, repetitive, desperate bark of an animal who had watched something disappear and could not follow, and would not stop calling until it came back. The bark carried across the frozen lake. The ice cutters looked up. They saw the dog. They did not see the Duchess. Julian was in his study, at his desk. The study window, which he kept cracked open in all weather because the fire made the room close and because fresh air was one of the few indulgences he permitted himself, faced east, directly toward the lake. He was reviewing the quarterly accounts. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and on Tuesday afternoons he reviewed the quarterly accounts because the quarterly accounts did not require warmth or vulnerability or the opening of any doors, and they were therefore exactly the kind of thing Julian Ashworth was suited for. He heard the barking. Through the half-open window, across 300 yards of frozen lawn, he heard Button. He knew Button's bark the way a body knows a sound it has absorbed without permission, not as a fact, but as a reflex. He knew this bark was wrong. He stood. He walked to the window. He looked out. He saw the lake. He saw the ice cutters running. He saw Button, at the edge of a dark opening in the ice, barking. He did not see Nell. What happened next was not a decision. Julian Ashworth had spent his adult life making decisions, measured decisions, calibrated decisions, decisions weighed on scales so fine they could register the difference between prudent and merely cautious. What happened next was not on the same continent as a decision. What happened next was the wall coming down. He was out of the study before his mind had finished processing what his eyes had seen. Through the hall, out the front door, running, not walking, not striding, running, across the frozen lawn, down the slope, in his shirt sleeves, in January, the way a man runs who has not run since he was a boy, and whose body has remembered how faster than his dignity can intervene. Mr. Locke, the valet, standing at the boot-room window, watched the Duke of Hartfield sprint across his own grounds in his shirt sleeves. 5 years of service. He had never seen the Duke move faster than a measured walk, he told Mrs. Hewitt later. It was the most alarming thing he had witnessed in the house, and he included the kitchen fire of the previous spring. Julian reached the lake. He did not stop at the edge. He did not test the ice. He did not assess. Assessment was the business of a man who had time. Julian had the distance between himself and the dark water and nothing else. He ran onto the ice, toward the hole, toward Button, and his voice did something it had not done in 13 years. It left his body without permission. It left at a volume and a rawness that the ice cutters, running from 40 yards, heard clearly. Nell. Not Eleanor, not your Grace. Nell. The name no one in the household had ever heard him use. The name he had never used, because using it would be intimate, and intimacy was a door he had kept sealed for a year. The door was open now. What came through it was her name, raw, across a frozen lake. He reached the hole. The crack had spread wider than the original break, the weakened ice fracturing outward in a rough circle, the dark water surging. He dropped to his knees. Her hands were there, white-knuckled on the jagged edge of the ice, her face just below the surface, her mouth gasping in the narrow space between water and the frozen sheet. The current had pulled her body sideways, but her grip had held. Her grip was failing. He seized her wrists. The cold of the water was a physical blow, a thing with weight and teeth, and he did not feel it. Or he felt it, and it was irrelevant, which is not the same thing but arrives at the same place. He pulled. The ice cracked further under his weight. He braced one knee against a thicker section and pulled, and she came up through the water like something the lake was releasing only reluctantly, heavy with cold, her face white, her eyes rolling, her body going slack the moment her hands released their hold on the edge. He pulled her onto the ice. He pulled her against his chest. He held her on the frozen lake with the cutters running toward them, and Button barking beside them, and the water still surging in the open hole, and her face was against his shirt, and her coat was soaking and heavy, and he could feel her breathing. He could feel it against his ribs. She was breathing, and he said her name again. Not screaming this time, into her hair, into the wet wool. Nell, Nell, Nell. Garrick, the lead ice cutter, reached them first. 20 years he had worked this lake. He told the others later at the village inn that the Duke's face was not a face he had seen on a living man. It was the face of a man who has looked at the worst thing in the world and decided the worst thing is not permitted. "Your Grace, we must move her. The ice is not sound here." Julian looked at Garrick. Garrick did not finish the thought. Julian stood. He lifted her. Not supported, not assisted. Lifted. The full weight of her, soaking, across the ice, off the lake, up the slope, across the lawn, through the front door, past the servants gathered in the hall, past Mrs. Hewitt with a blanket, past Mr. Locke holding a coat, past Mrs. Blackwell, the housekeeper, standing empty-handed with shock on her face. He carried her through the house and up the stairs and into her room and laid her on the bed and turned to the door. "Get the physician, now. Nobody leaves this room until I say." Nobody had ever heard that voice. His commands for 13 years had arrived in his usual measured tone, a man placing an order for stationery. This was not that tone. This was a man issuing instructions from the bottom of something he had fallen into and was not sure how to top. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Chapter 3. Dr. Hargreaves arrived within the hour. He examined Nell. He warmed her gradually. Blankets, hot water, warm bricks at her feet. The cold was the danger, not the water. Her lungs were clear. She had not breathed the lake. The shock and the temperature were what had taken her consciousness. She would wake when her body warmed. It might take hours. "She will wake." Julian's voice was not asking. Dr. Hargreaves, who had been a physician for 22 years and who understood the difference between a question and a command issued from a place beyond questions, assured him gently that the signs were favorable. The doctor left the room. Julian sat beside the bed. He had not changed his clothes. The shirt had dried into a stiff, wrinkled, ruined shape. His hands were the color of chalk. He held her hand. Both of his wrapped around one of hers, pressing warmth into fingers that were still cold. His own hands were shaking, and the shaking was not from the cold. Mrs. Blackwell, who had served the household for 23 years and known Julian as a boy, stood in the doorway and watched the Duke of Hartfield hold his wife's hand in the light of day, voluntarily, with no obligation or dance requiring it, for the first time in their marriage. She had to leave the room because she was going to cry, and she would not cry in front of the Duke, except the Duke, she could see as she turned, was crying himself. He did not know he was crying. The tears were on his face, and he was not wiping them, and he was not acknowledging them. They were leaving his body without permission, the way his voice had left his body on the ice. 13 years of wall, and the wall was down, and the things behind it were coming out the way water comes through a broken dam, not because anyone opened the gate, but because the gate was never strong enough for what was behind it. He talked to her. He had not talked to her, genuinely talked, in 12 months. He talked to her now, the way a man talks when there is no wall left, and no audience, and no fear of being heard. And the words were clumsy and unpracticed, and he kept stopping, and the stopping was the truest part. He told her about the bee. Not the first, which was a dinner where she was seated too far away. The second, at a garden party, in the last week of May, when he was 26 and had been a house for 12 years, and had not expected to feel anything that afternoon or any afternoon. She was standing beside a rose bush. She was alone. She was wearing a yellow dress, the color of the dahlia she was about to recommend, and she was talking to a bee. She was explaining to the bee, in a tone of calm and reasonable negotiation, that the rose was welcome but past its best, and that the dahlia 3 feet to the left was, in her opinion, a superior option. She enumerated the dahlia's qualities. She acknowledged the rose's service. She did not raise her voice. The bee did not respond, or responded in a way she chose to interpret as interest, because she continued. Julian, standing on a gravel path 12 feet away with a glass of champagne he had forgotten he was holding, watched a woman conduct diplomatic relations with an insect. And the thing that happened inside him was not dramatic. It was not a thunderclap. It was the sound a wall makes when a crack appears in the foundation. A hairline fracture, invisible from the outside, deep enough to be structural. And he stood on the gravel path, and he felt the fracture happen, and he did not move. Because moving would have meant acknowledging that the wall had cracked, and acknowledging the crack would have meant looking at what was behind it. And what was behind it was 13 years of not feeling, and the feeling was still there, all of it, waiting, enormous, undimmed, and the woman in the yellow dress was talking to a bee, and he was in love with her, and the love was already too large to say aloud, and he had known her for approximately 90 seconds. He told her this. He told it to her closed eyes, and the fire burning low, and Button asleep at the foot of the bed, and his voice was rough and uneven, a voice she had never heard because he had never used it. He told her that the crack never healed, that it widened, that every time he saw her after the garden party, the crack widened, and the feeling pressed harder, and the wall held, but the holding cost him something, and the cost was that he could not look at her for very long without looking away, and she probably thought the looking away was disinterest, and it was a man trying not to drown in his own living room. He told her he proposed 4 months later with a prepared speech that contained the phrase, "I believe we would be well suited," and that the speech was the most dishonest thing he had ever said, because what he believed was that she was the only person he had met in 13 years who made the wall feel like a punishment instead of a protection. And he could not say this, so he said, "well suited," and well suited was the loneliest word he knew. He told her about the note, the one she left in his paper. 6 words, "I hope your day is good." He found it over breakfast on a Tuesday. He read it once. He put the paper down. He finished his eggs. He went to his study. He closed the door. He took the note out. He read it again, and again, and again. Each time the words meant more, not less, because they were small and kind, and she had written them for no reason except that she wanted his day to be good, and no one had wanted his day to be good since his mother, and his mother was dead, and his chest ached with something that was the precise opposite of composure. He kept it. In a wooden box he made at 12, top drawer of his desk. 200 times he had read it. The paper was wearing at the folds. He had never answered it because answering would have meant opening the door, and the door was the only thing between himself and the weather. He told her about the lavender, quietly. He had not put it in the bin. He pressed it between the pages of a book on the 3rd shelf, a book he never read, a book he kept because the lavender was in it, and the lavender smelled like her. And every morning, before he came downstairs, before the good morning that gave her nothing, he opened the book and he checked that the lavender was still there, and it was always still there, and the checking was the closest thing to a prayer he had, and he did not believe in prayer, but he believed in the lavender. He told her about the novel. He did not shelve it. He read it in 3 nights, alone, in the study, after she was asleep, turning pages while the fire burned low, reading a book she had chosen for him with his hands on pages her hands had touched. And the reading was the most intimate thing he had done in his marriage. And she did not know, because he could not let her see him reading a gift she had given him, because seeing would mean acknowledging that she was reaching for him, and reaching back would mean the door would open, and the feelings would come, and the feelings would be his father's feelings, and he would rather she thought him empty than thought him a storm. "I have been a house, Nell," his voice breaking on her name because her name was a door too, and every door was open now. "I told myself a house was what you needed, something solid, something reliable, something that did not shake. But a house without anyone in it is not a house. It is a building. I have been a building. You have been living inside a building, and I am sorry. I am so sorry." She did not respond. She was not conscious. He held her hand. The fire burned. The room was quiet. Outside, the frost was deep, and the lake was still, and the stars were the cold, hard, distant stars of January. And inside, a man was holding a woman's hand and crying and telling her things he should have told her on the first morning of their marriage. And the distance between the first morning and this night was a year, and the year was the loneliest year of his life, and it did not need to have been. And the not needing to have been was the worst part. At 4:30 in the morning, her fingers moved. A small movement, the smallest. A contraction, a curl, a tightening around his hand that was so slight he might have imagined it, except that he had been holding this hand for 7 hours, and he knew it now, the way he knew his own pulse. And it moved, her fingers moved, and his breathing stopped. He watched her face. He had been watching her face for 7 hours. He knew it now in a way he had not known it in 12 months of marriage, because in 12 months of marriage he had not let himself look, and now he had done nothing but look. And her face was mapped inside him, the freckle below her left ear he had never noticed, the small scar at her temple from a childhood fall he had never asked about, the way her lips parted slightly when she breathed. 7 hours. He had memorized a year's worth of looking in 7 hours, and his eyes were raw and dry from the crying and the not sleeping in the fire, and he did not close them, because closing them meant not seeing her, and he had spent a year not seeing her, and he was finished with not seeing. Her eyelids shifted, a flutter, then stillness, then another flutter. Her lips parted further. A deeper breath, a conscious breath, the breath of a woman climbing back from somewhere far and cold, and her chest rose with it, and her hand tightened around his again, stronger this time, and his throat closed completely. Her eyes opened. The ceiling, the fire burned low, the embers red, her room, her bed, the blankets heavy and warm, the smell of wood smoke and candle wax and something else, something salt, something human. She turned her head. Julian was beside the bed, still in the ruined shirt which had dried stiff hours ago, and which he had not noticed and would not have cared about if he had. His face. She looked at his face and her breathing changed. His eyes were swollen, red-rimmed, the skin beneath them dark. His cheeks were streaked with dried salt, the tracks visible in the low firelight, a map of hours of crying he had not wiped away. His jaw was rough with a day's growth. His hair, which she had never seen disordered, was disordered, and his hands, which she had never seen shake, were shaking, and he was looking at her with everything. Every feeling he had hidden for a year, every silence, every careful, "Good morning, Eleanor," that had meant something so far from good morning that the words might as well have been a scream, all of it on his face, uncovered, unhidden, ungovernable. He was the most undone human being she had ever seen, and he was looking at her as though she were the only thing in the room, and the room were the only thing in the world. Julian. He could not respond. His throat was sealed. His mouth opened and nothing came. His hands tightened on hers and the shaking worsened, and his face, his wrecked, swollen, salt-tracked face, did something that broke her chest open, a crumpling, a contraction, the face of a man who has been holding himself together by holding a hand, and who now, with the hand holding back, does not need to hold himself together anymore, and cannot. "You are crying." Her voice was rough from the cold and the hours, and her chest was doing something she had not expected, a tightness that had nothing to do with the lake, a heat behind her eyes that was climbing her throat, because she had never seen him. She had been married to him for a year, and she had never seen him, and here he was, at 4 in the morning, in a chair, undone, and the sight of him undone was doing something to her that she was not ready for and could not stop. He nodded. "You have not held my hand in daylight in a year." A sound. Not a word. The involuntary sound a man makes when a fact he already knows is spoken aloud by the person it was done to, and the hearing of it is worse than the knowing of it, and the sound was raw, and it came from somewhere deep, and she heard it in her own chest like a blow. She lifted her free hand. Slowly, because her arm was heavy and her body was still cold in places and warm in others, and everything ached. She put her hand on his face. She touched his cheek. She touched the dried tears, the salt, the rough jaw. Her hand was still cold from the lake. His face was hot from the crying. The temperature between them, her cold and his heat, was the most intimate thing that had ever passed between them in the light, and her fingers trembled against his skin, and the trembling was not from the cold. "Stay. I am not leaving." His voice, breaking through at last, rough, nothing like the voice she knew. The voice she knew was measured and controlled and gave her nothing. This voice was giving her everything, and it did not know how to stop. "I do not mean tonight. Stay. Tomorrow. The day after. Stay in the room. Stay where I can see you. I have been married to you for a year, and I have not seen you until tonight. Stay where I can see you." He pressed his forehead against their joined hands, his mouth against her knuckles. He stayed there. She could feel his breath against her skin, uneven, and the wetness of new tears, and the pressure of his forehead, and her own throat was aching now, a deep, structural ache. The ache of a woman who spent a year being strong, and who is watching the strongest man she knows fall apart in a chair, and who understands, for the first time, that strength and silence are not the same thing, and never were. She moved her free hand through his hair. Slowly. She had never touched his hair. He had never let anyone touch his hair. He did not pull away. The not pulling away was the most radical thing he had ever done, and she felt it, the significance of it, the weight of a man who had held himself apart for 13 years, allowing fingers in his hair at 4 in the morning, and her throat ached with it. "I thought you did not care." He lifted his head, looked at her. "I have cared so much that I could not hold it and be in the same room with you. I chose nothing instead of everything because I was afraid that everything was what my father chose, and my father's everything consumed my mother. I would rather you thought me cold than thought me consuming." A silence, not a long one, a silence the exact size of a year. "Julian, you are not consuming. You are a man holding a hand in the middle of the night, and you cannot stop crying, and there is no performance in it, and no audience, and no storm." She was looking at his face, his wrecked, ungoverned, human face. "Your father's love was weather. Yours is very quiet." Chapter 4. Julian did not reset. This was the thing the household discovered over the following days with mounting astonishment, and what could only be described, in a house that had prided itself on discretion, as badly concealed delight. The wall was down. It was not going back up. The changes were specific, observable. To a household that had operated for 13 years on the assumption that the Duke did not feel things, profoundly disorienting. On the second day, Julian came to breakfast. Nell was still upstairs, recovering. He ate his eggs. He drank his coffee. He turned to Mr. Locke, standing by the sideboard with the quiet competence of a man whose entire profession consisted of anticipating the needs of a person who had never expressed one. "Mr. Locke, please ask Mrs. Hewitt to prepare a tray for her grace. Tea, toast, and—" A pause that contained a man confronting the fact that he did not know his own wife's jam preference. Does she prefer marmalade or jam? Mr. Locke, 5 years in service, never once asked about the Duchess's condiment preferences, managed to respond without visible surprise. "Raspberry jam, Your Grace." Julian nodded. "And a flower. From the hothouse. Something yellow. A yellow flower, Your Grace." "A yellow flower, Mr. Locke." The tray went upstairs. Tea, toast, raspberry jam, and a single yellow dahlia in a small vase. Nell received it in bed. She looked at the dahlia for a long time. She put it on the bedside table, and something in her face opened, not all at once, not dramatically, but the way a window opens when someone finally turns the latch. She was not ready to walk through the door, but she could see the room on the other side, and there was light in it. On the 4th day she came downstairs. The morning room, her room, chair by the fire, blanket, button on her feet. Julian walked in carrying a dining chair. He placed it beside hers, sat down, picked up a book. "You are in the morning room." She was watching him the way a naturalist watches a species doing something previously unrecorded. I am. You do not use the morning room. I am using it now. Why? Because you are in it, he read. She looked at him reading. She had been married to a building for a year, and now the building had walked into her room and sat down and opened a book, and the building had gray-green eyes and long legs that did not fit the dining chair, and she could see the muscles in his forearm where he had rolled his sleeve, and she had to look away from the forearm, because the forearm was doing the same thing to her breathing that the gate hinge had done in October. And she picked up her own book, and they read in silence, side by side, for 2 hours. Button on Nell's feet looked at Julian with an expression that contained, in a small dog's limited but eloquent range, approximately 12 months of vindication. On the 7th day, Julian canceled a meeting with his solicitor, coming from London, scheduled 6 weeks, canceled by note, morning of. Mr. Graves, I regret our meeting must be postponed. Her Grace is recovering, and I am needed at home. He was not needed. Nell was recovering well. She was walking, dressed, eating downstairs. He was choosing to be present, and the distinction between being needed and choosing to be present was the distinction he had failed to make for a year. Mr. Locke, in the kitchen after delivering the cancellation note. He canceled Graves. Mrs. Hewitt, rolling pastry, receiving information the way a harbor receives ships without interrupting her own operations. He has never canceled Graves. He has never done any of this. It is the lake. Mr. Locke, with the careful precision of a man who had been composing the thought for 7 days, it is not the lake, it is her Grace. The lake just broke the bottle. Mrs. Hewitt considered this. Mr. Locke, that is the most poetic thing you have ever said. I have been composing it for a week. It will not happen again. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. On the 12th day, Julian walked Nell to the village. The Duke did not walk to the village. The Duke rode, or took the carriage, or did not go because the village contained people who might speak to him. Julian walked, with Nell, side by side, Button ahead in a state of disbelief so total it manifested as extra speed. 5 minutes of silence. Then Julian, I would like to carry your basket. Nell was carrying the Thursday basket, the food and broth for the elderly and the ill, the same basket she had carried every week since autumn while her husband reviewed accounts in his study and did not ask where she went. I can carry it. I know you can carry it. I would like to carry it. She gave him the basket. They visited Mrs. Hewitt's mother, who was 83 and who had a cough that had settled in her chest with the stubborn permanence of an unwelcome relative. Julian stood in the doorway, holding the basket with the air of a very tall man who had misplaced his hands and was hoping nobody would notice. This is my husband. Mrs. Hewitt's mother peered at him over her blanket. I know who he is, dear. He looks different. He is different. Taller than I expected. He looks taller when he is not on a horse looking like a man who has swallowed something disagreeable. Sit down, Your Grace. Julian sat. The chair was too small. His knees rose level with his chest, giving him the appearance of a very formal grasshopper. The tea had the approximate character of warm water that had once been in the same room as a tea leaf, but had not formed a meaningful relationship with it. He drank it. He asked about her cough. Real questions, present questions, specific. Mrs. Blackwell had told Nell, on the 3rd day after the lake, that the Duke had run, that he had sprinted across the grounds in his shirt sleeves, that he had screamed her name, not Eleanor, the other name, the one nobody had ever heard him use. Nell had listened to this and kept her face still and gone upstairs, and sat on her bed and pressed her hands together in her lap until the shaking stopped. Because the picture of Julian, Julian who did not run, Julian who did not raise his voice, Julian who had not called her Nell in 12 months of marriage, running across frozen ground and screaming for her, was too large a thing to hold without her hands trembling. She watched him now in Mrs. Hewitt's mother's cottage, in his too small chair, drinking his terrible tea, asking an old woman about the specific character of her cough, and she thought, "He is in there. He has always been in there." The lake did not change him. The lake just broke the bottle. On the 19th day, Julian attempted to cook. He had never cooked. He did not know where the salt was kept. He did not know that eggs required water to boil and could not be placed in a dry pan over high heat, which was what he did at 6 o'clock in the morning, producing a smell that woke Mrs. Hewitt and brought her downstairs at a speed that impressed even her. The Duke was at the stove in his shirt sleeves, holding a smoking pan with the determination of a man who considered the smoke a personal failing correctable through willpower. The pan contained what had, at some point, been 2 eggs. They were now a dark, geological substance adhered to the bottom with the permanence of something from the Jurassic period that intended to remain. "Your Grace, you have killed the eggs." "I am aware the eggs have not gone well." "The eggs are beyond medical attention, Your Grace." "May I have 2 more?" The Duke wished to make breakfast for Her Grace. He wished to have made it himself. Mrs. Hewitt gave him 2 more eggs. She showed him the water, the pot, the salt. She stood beside the Duke of Hartfield at 6 in the morning and taught him to boil an egg, and the Duke listened with the unblinking attention of a man learning a matter of state importance. And the egg boiled, and the egg was correct, and the Duke regarded it with the satisfaction of a man who had just passed a significant piece of legislation. He carried the tray upstairs himself. Tea, toast, raspberry jam, the boiled egg, and a yellow dahlia. The dahlia had become a daily thing now, placed every morning by the hothouse gardener, who had learned to prepare it without being asked. Nell woke. She saw the tray. She saw the egg. She saw the dahlia. She saw Julian standing beside her bed in his shirt sleeves, faintly sooty, with a smell about him that could only be described as recent catastrophe, and an expression that a painter might have called triumph in the face of adversity, and that Nell classified, with the precision of a woman who had studied this man for a year, as a man who has just survived combat with a breakfast food. "You made me breakfast." "I boiled an egg," Mrs. Hewitt supervised. "The first attempt was not successful. The second was adequate. I would like to improve." She sat up. She took the egg, tapped it with a spoon, peeled it, bit into it. Slightly overcooked, the yolk chalky at the edges, the white resistant in a way that suggested the egg had surrendered under protest. By any fair assessment, a mediocre egg. It is perfect. It is overcooked. Julian, it is perfect. He stood beside her bed and watched her eat a mediocre egg, and the feeling came, without the wall, without the restraint, the specific, devastating, uncontainable rightness of having done a small thing for a person he loved, and having the small thing be received. And the feeling did not consume the room, and the feeling did not become a storm, and it did not exhaust her or overwhelm her or become a weather system she had to endure. The feeling was a boiled egg, a dahlia, a man standing in a sooty shirt at 6 in the morning. It was the exact size of the room and not 1 inch larger. He was not his father. He had never been his father. His father's love was a performance. Julian's love was a boiled egg. The difference was everything. Chapter 5. 6 weeks after the accident, on an evening in early March, Nell came to the study. The study had been Julian's room the way the morning room was hers, the room where he sat behind the desk, and the desk was the last fortification, the final piece of furniture between himself and the world. Except the morning room was no longer hers alone. He sat in it every afternoon now, reading beside her, quiet unless she spoke, but present. Present in a way that was still new enough that she noticed it every time, the way a person notices warmth after a long winter and does not yet trust it to last. She stood in the doorway. He looked up. She did not sit in the chair across from his desk. She sat on the edge of the desk itself, beside his papers, close to him, closer than she had been in a year of marriage, except in the dark of that night when she came back from the water. His forearm was beside her hand. She could feel the warmth of him through her sleeve. On the ice, when you came, you ran. Yes, you have never run. In a year of marriage, I have never seen you move faster than a walk. I have not run since I was 14. What made you run? Button was asleep on the rug between them, positioned with the strategic precision of a small animal who had decided these two humans were no longer permitted to be in separate rooms. I heard Button barking. I looked through the window. I saw the hole. I did not see you. For approximately 4 seconds, I looked at a place where you should have been, and you were not there. 4 seconds. In 4 seconds, every system I have built, every wall, every measured word, every controlled silence was irrelevant. The accounts did not matter. The estate did not matter. The composure did not matter. The only thing that mattered was reaching the water before the water took you. And my body understood this before my mind did, and my body ran. I did not decide to run. I decided, 13 years ago, not to feel things. My legs overruled the decision. Your legs were right. My legs were right about everything. My head has been wrong for 13 years. She looked at him. The fire made his face half gold, half shadow. Not about everything. The estate is well managed. The drainage is beyond reproach. The accounts are immaculate. Your head is excellent at the things heads are built for. Your head is terrible at the things hearts are built for. You have been running this marriage as if it were drainage. I am beginning to understand that marriages are not drainage. That is progress. Modest progress. A pause. Then quieter. Julian, I would like to tell you something. He waited. In the first months, I left you things. A book, lavender, a note. I know. Quietly. I kept them. A silence. The word kept, settling between them like a stone dropped into still water. I kept all of them. He opened the top drawer. He took out the wooden box, opened it. Inside, a folded piece of paper worn nearly translucent at the creases. A pressed sprig of lavender that had kept its color with the stubbornness of a thing that refused to die. The note has been in this drawer since the week you left it. The lavender was in a book on the 3rd shelf. I moved it here. I read the novel in 3 nights in this room after you were asleep. She looked at the box. She looked at the note inside it. She reached out to touch it, and her hand missed, her fingers closing on air an inch above the paper. And she had to reach again, and her hand was shaking, and the shaking was visible, and she could not stop it. She touched the edge of the note with one finger. The paper so worn from his handling that the pressure of her fingertip moved it. You read my note 200 times. Her voice had done something. Not a break, not a crack, a thinning, as though the words were being pushed through a space that had suddenly become too narrow. Approximately. And you said nothing. Her throat was working. She was a woman who had spent a year being steady, being the one who stopped trying, being the one who built warmth elsewhere, who made soup, who carried baskets, who did not press her face into her own palm and cry. She had been the steady one, because someone in this marriage had to be. And Julian was not available for the role. And she was practical. And practical women did not sit on desks with tears running down their faces because a man had kept a note in a box. But the note was so thin. The folds were so worn. 200 times. He had read her 6 words 200 times and said nothing. And the nothing was not indifference. The nothing was the opposite of indifference. The nothing was love so frightened of itself that it hid in furniture. And the knowing of this, the knowing of it now, after a year of thinking she was married to a man who did not care, broke the steady thing she had been, broke it cleanly, the way ice breaks, from beneath, from a warmth that had been running under the surface all along. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, the gesture fierce, impatient, annoyed at her own tears the way she was annoyed at everything that refused to behave efficiently. I am not a woman who cries at stationery. And yet, and yet, she almost laughed. It came out half-wrecked. You kept everything. I kept every piece of evidence that you reached for me, and I locked it in drawers and pressed it in books and hid it from you. Because showing you that I kept it would require showing you that it mattered. And showing you that it mattered would require showing you that you mattered. And showing you that you mattered was the thing I could not do. Because the showing was what my father did. And the showing broke my mother. He looked at her. She was sitting on his desk, with the wooden box open between them, tears on her face that she was wiping away as fast as they arrived, and her face was doing something he had not seen, something layered, something that held anger and tenderness and grief and relief, and the specific, particular ache of a woman who has just learned that the man she believed did not love her, loved her with a force that required furniture to contain. My father loved my mother. Genuinely, the love was real. It was also a natural disaster. It consumed every room. My mother could not breathe inside it. She loved him, and she was exhausted by him, and the exhaustion was the cost of his love. I watched her pay it. I decided I would never charge that price. I would love quietly, in drawers and bookshelves and unsent replies, in a way that cost you nothing. He paused. It cost you everything. The silence cost you everything. You stopped leaving things by summer. You stopped because I did not answer, and the not answering told you I did not care, and you believed it, and I let you believe it because the alternative, the showing, the telling, the being visible, was the thing I was most afraid of. I let you believe I was cold because the truth, that I was so full of feeling I was afraid of the feeling, was a door I would not open. She was quiet for a moment, her hand still on the edge of the worn note, her breathing not quite even. Then, "Julian, you boiled me an egg." "I did. Your father would have ordered a 7-course breakfast on silver with musicians." "He would have, with weeping." "You boiled an egg, a mediocre egg, and the egg did not consume the room." "The egg was the size of the egg. That is what your love is. It is the size of an egg. It is not the size of a thunderstorm. You were afraid it would be, and it was not, and the years you spent hiding were years you spent protecting me from something that does not exist." She reached for his hand, took it, held it. "I would like you to keep boiling the eggs. I will. And carrying the basket. I will. And sitting in the morning room. I will. And saying my name, my real name, not Eleanor. Nell. Again. Nell. Again." The third time his voice did something. A giving way. Not of composure, because the composure was long gone, but of the last small distance between what he felt and what he could say. The distance closed. The word was enough. "Nell!" She leaned forward. She kissed him. Not a formal kiss, not a social kiss, not the kiss at the altar. A real kiss, on the mouth, at his desk, with his papers beneath her and his hand in hers, and Button lifting his head from the rug to observe the proceedings with the deeply satisfied expression of a creature who had been waiting 12 months for the obvious. She pulled back. That is how a person responds to a note. I will remember. A year late. I am aware of the delay. I expect interest. He laughed. He laughed in his study with his wife sitting on his quarterly accounts, and his dog watching from the rug, and the fire burning, and the wooden box open between them, with its worn note and its pressed lavender, and the laugh was, like everything about him that was real, quieter than anyone expected. Julian Ashworth did not become a different person. He became the person he was before he decided, at 14, to be nobody. What replaced the composure was not its opposite, not the storm, not the weather, not his father's consuming force. What replaced it was presence. Quiet, specific, daily. He was in the room. He was a man who made breakfast and carried baskets and walked to the village and sat in the morning room and drank bad tea in small chairs, and who said his wife's name every morning, her real name, before anything else, before the eggs, before the coffee, before the post. The eggs improved, weekly. The yolks went from chalky to firm to, eventually, a runny gold that Nell declared perfect, and that Julian continued to regard with the mild suspicion of a man who did not entirely trust any process he could not control with a spreadsheet. Mrs. Hewitt told Mr. Locke the Duke had a natural hand for a soft boil, a statement so improbable that Mr. Locke had to sit down. The dahlia remained, every morning. The hothouse gardener kept a dedicated row. When the dahlias were out of season, he substituted winter jasmine, and when the jasmine ended, he grew forced crocuses, and the color was always yellow, because yellow was the color of the dress she wore the day she argued with a bee. And Julian had never told anyone this, but the gardener worked it out on his own, because gardeners are observant people who understand what a flower means when a man asks for the same one every day. The door between their bedrooms stayed open, propped with a book. Julian had opened it on the second night and wedged a book against it so it could not swing shut, and neither of them had moved the book, and the door that had opened at night and closed every morning with its soft, definitive click for 12 months, now stood open at all hours, in daylight and in dark, and the silence where the click used to be was the loudest change in the house. The book was a volume on crop rotation. Nell considered this, on balance, the most romantic use of a treatise on winter wheat she was likely to encounter in her lifetime. He walked to the village every Thursday. He carried the basket. He sat in chairs too small for his legs and drank tea that did not deserve the name. And he asked old women about their coughs and old men about their fences. And he was, each week, a little less like a duke visiting a foreign country, and a little more like a man visiting his neighbors, which was what they were, and what they had always been. Button approved. Button had approved since the first morning Julian carried a chair into the morning room. Button, who had maintained a solo vigil over two humans who would not be in the same room, accepted Julian's reformation with the brisk, magnanimous air of a small creature whose professional opinion had been vindicated. Every morning, Julian walked into the breakfast room, and every morning, for the space of a breath, he stood in the doorway, and the room held two versions of itself. The version that had existed for a year, the long table, the distance, the newspaper, the careful, "Good morning, Eleanor," and the version that existed now, the dahlia, the eggs he had made, and Nell at her place, and the light on her hair, and the whole unbearable, ordinary beauty of a woman eating breakfast whom he had almost lost to a frozen lake in January. One breath. Then he said two words and a name. "Good morning, Nell." Not Eleanor, not Your Grace. Nell. Spoken the way he had first spoken it, on the ice, when it tore out of him without permission. Except now it was not torn, now it was given, freely. Every morning, and it cost him nothing, and it was worth everything, and the fact that it cost him nothing was the proof, the final proof, that he was not his father, because his father's love had cost everyone in the room, and Julian's love cost no one. And the breakfast was warm, and the dahlia was yellow, and his wife looked up and smiled, and the smile was the answer. She heard it. She would hear it every morning for the rest of her life, and she would not tire of it. Not because the words were remarkable, because she remembered the silence they replaced. She had sat at this table for a year and listened to a man say her formal name in a voice that gave her nothing. And now the nothing was over, and in its place was this, a man in a doorway, saying her name, the real one, and the name landed in her chest every morning in the same place, a place that had been empty for a year and was not empty now. Every morning. Without exception, without restraint. Good morning, Nell. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from and what the story made you feel. Do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss new stories.